And so we dealt with the dress code, but members, let's keep it the way we ought to, so that we can deal with a good example from the House. And I've said this before. I said, I don't mind how you do it. You have a bigger audience. Parliament side gets hit by hundreds of thousands of people. So that's what you're playing to. Finally, I want to say to members who are making their presentations, step out of line, I am not going to stop the clock. So if you're going to argue minutes, I will prolong the argument with you, and that way your time gets cut. But if you're interrupted from the other side and I have to take a point of order, I'll stop the clock. But if you step out of line, the clock rolls. Sherlock?
Mr. Speaker, if I'm permitted.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
While I endorse what you're saying, it is assumed that there will be fairness and even-handedness. I have no problem whatsoever, but there is a penchant in here for objecting to the opposition while government parliament manifests worse than any decorum we can talk about.
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. And I will tell you, fairness is a matter of subjectivity. The rule is, or the rule book is the standing orders. That's where we start. And so when we speak of fairness, it is objectivity in the implementation of the standing orders. That's where fairness begins.
Mr. Speaker, you get it right away. You would agree that if it is based on the law, then it is not subjective. It is objective because it is determined by law.
I love this exchange, except to be a good speaker, you have to be a great listener. And so if you listen carefully to what I've said, you would not have made that comment. And I'm not going to entertain another exchange with the Leader of the Opposition on this matter. I said fairness is subjective, full stop. And then I went on to say where we start in this House is the implementation of the standing orders. Sherlock?
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers and reports, etc.
Honorable Member Minister McCoy, please, watch your language. Don't let me have to ask you to excuse yourself from today's sitting. Honorable Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs.
In the absence of the General at this moment, Mr. Speaker, could I present on his behalf the High Court's rules in regards to the Civil Procedure Amendment Rules?
Honorable Minister, I think the rule says he has to have given you the authority. Has he?
Yes, he has.
Thank you.
By WhatsApp. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I'd like to present on behalf of the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs the Civil Procedure Amendment Rules 2024, number 1 and 2024. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Without notice, questions on notice. Statements by ministers, including policy statements, personal explanations, requests for leave to move definite matters of urgent public importance. motions relating to the business of the National Assembly and moved by a minister, introduction of bills, public business, government's business.
Honorable members, the Assembly will resume the debate on the motion for the approval of the estimates of expenditure for the financial year 2024. Our first speaker today is the Honorable Member, Mr. Roysdale Ford, Senior Counsel. Honorable Member, floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this $1.146 trillion budget, touted the biggest budget in the nation's history, is being packaged to fellow Guyanese as staying the course, building prosperity for all. If I was to use one word to describe it, that word would be uninspiring. It is built on shifting sand, made of proper foundation. It lacks philosophical rudder. It fails to articulate a clear and compelling vision. It fails to articulate long-term goals, objectives, or a roadmap for development. It fails to tackle urgent and important social issues. It fails to adequate visitors, education, healthcare, and social welfare. It lacks clear economic and social indicators and measurements for success. It facilitates the disproportionate allocation on concrete projects with $2.214 billion and $2.041 billion for roads and bridges at the expense of human capital development. It failed to engage critical stakeholders and citizens in meaningful consultations. It is simply uninspiring. In fact, the rubric under which these nice-sounding set of words and figures have been assembled, staying the course, building prosperity for all, is really another way of saying more of the same partisan policies that exclude minorities and marginalized groups from the political process, more of the same policies that facilitate and exacerbate social and economic inequities in our society, more of the same policies that allow unsustainable growth and lopsided development in a trickle-down economy, more of the same policies that facilitate structural discrimination and corruption, facilitated by the interplay of partisan politics and uncontrolled, impulsive splurging of oil money by the incumbent government. This side of the House began last Monday to prosecute this budget, to determine whether the PPP has changed its ways, having heard the demands of the parliamentary opposition and other sections of society to be inclusive and to craft a budget that leaves no group or individual behind, or whether it has doubled down on the famous George Orwell's line that all are equal, but some are more equal than others. This budget has fallen short on many fronts. It lacks an inclusive approach in conceptualization, equal and equitable allocation of resources, the hallmarks of good governance, which according to the United Nations has 8 characteristics: participatory, consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and follows the rule of law. At paragraph 4.187 of the budget speech, the Honorable Member, Dr. Ash Almar, has been to consistently embrace democracy, constitutionality, budget as was done. Budget. Principle as outlined in Article 13 of the Constitution. Cognizant of this constitutional violation, this side of the House not only condemns the disregard of citizens' right to the involvement, but will peruse this budget line by line, taking seriously our constitutional role and the foundational aspirations of our forebears as enshrined in the Constitution and in our preamble to the Constitution to forge a system of governance that promotes broad-based participation, national decision-making in order to develop a viable economy and a harmonious community based on democratic values, social justice, fundamental human rights, and the rule of law. Leading up to this budget, the government busied itself with what would call a public relations stunt, inviting groups to participate in budget consultation. This, you will recall, Mr. Speaker, was the period when the government was placed under the international spotlight for its discriminatory management. And rather than change course, it set out to deceive. But today I offer a friendly reminder in the words of United States President Abraham Lincoln: you can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time, but you can never fool all the people all of the time. This does much violence to the spirit and letter of Article 13 of our Constitution. In that context, nearly 50% of our citizens have been excluded from the process, which arrived at decisions which would shape the course and quality of their lives, communities, and nation. This raises serious questions about accountability and governance. This lack of meaningful consultation with those who bear the brunt of fiscal policies is not just a procedural misstep. It is a disconcerting display of governance and that disregards the very essence of democracy. A serious disadvantage of sidestepping stakeholders' consultation is the increased risk of misallocation of funds. This lack of insight from those directly affected by budgetary decisions can result in a financial plan that simply fails to address the real needs of the people and hampers the nation's overall progress. Moreover, the absence of meaningful consultation undermines the democratic and good governance principles that should really undermine the budgetary process. Indeed, a budget is not merely a financial document. It is a reflection of the collective aspirations and felt needs of a society. By excluding critical stakeholders, such as community and other leaders, labor organizations, municipalities, councils, regional democratic councils, representatives of marginalized groups, the government is essentially sidelining the voices that could provide valuable perspectives on how to create a budget that is truly inclusive and responsive to the diverse needs of the population. The groups that met with the government, who took seriously their civic responsibilities to their constituents, got nothing meaningful to improve their quality of lives for the workers, the youths, the pensioners, the ordinary man, ordinary woman and child, and other vulnerable groups who comprise society's majority. The touted $3,000 increase in old age pension and disability pension really, in fact, amounts to $100 or less a day. In Guyana, you can buy nothing for $100. Raising the tax threshold by $15,000, which represents a 15% increase, means nothing to workers because over the last year, the cost of living has risen exponentially. This budget means nothing to those earning below $100,000. In an oil-rich economy where the national minimum wage has remained stagnant at a miserly sum of $86,150 per month, nothing was heard about ensuring the viability of the national insurance scheme as fair amounts as the readiness scheme will be around for future generations. By budget 2024 tells us that inflation was a mere 2% last year. Incredibly, with a contemplated massive 27% increase in government expenditure this year, relative to last year's revised expenditure, inflation is expected to increase marginally to 2.5% this year. The Economic Survey of Latin America and the Caribbean 2023 puts inflation in the United States and the United Kingdom at 4.4 and 6.8% respectively in 2003, and projects that it will be 2.8 and 3.0 respectively in 2004. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, the government's figures cannot be trusted. And if you want to measure the real measure of inflation, ask the ordinary men and women who face the market. For instance, a slice or a cut of pumpkin is being sold for $1,000 and sugar $300 a pound, which was a year ago $200 a slice, and sugar was $80 a pound. Rents have skyrocketed, leaving many families desperate and in need of proper shelter. Just 5 years ago, a two-bedroom house in Georgetown attracted a rent of $60,000. Today, a similar rent is over $120,000. Mr. Speaker, this House is reminded that the AP and UFC government did more for citizens with less. They did more, we did more for citizens with less. By the time we left office in 2020, we had moved the minimum wage from $39,570 in May 2015 to $70,000 in January 2019. This 77% increase over a short period of time was done without the enormous tax resources that are available to the present government. It was accomplished in the context of a growing economy and inflation at average 1% for the period between 2015 and 2020. Quite possibly the lowest inflation to be recorded in any 5-year period in the country's history. It would take far more than the current wage to purchase the same basket of goods and services that were bought with $70,000 in 2019. It is conservatively estimated that in order for Guyanese to enjoy an adequate minimum standard of living, the minimum wage should be $150,000 a month. Mr. Speaker, I'm compelled to ask the Honorable Minister with responsibility for finance a very important question. Is this $1 trillion budget in facts and figures the real budget for 2024? I'm not being facetious. The records will show that the past 4 years, this government has returned to this August House again and again for supplementary funds. In 2023, they returned 6 times, totaling more than $900 billion. These supplemental funds represented $900 billion, plus the $782 billion, which was touted to be the largest in the nation's history, giving us a grand total of $1,682,112,890,947. In the realm of fiscal responsibility, the government's penchant for representing budgets only to scurry back to this House to supplementary funds marks not only improper planning, but also places the legislative process in a precarious position. This theater of presentation seems to be a mere prologue to a recurring drama where the true financial narrative unfolds not in the initial grand announcement like we had on January 15 this year, but in the subsequent pleadings for additional allocations. And therefore, the pertinent question that now looms large in the minds of the citizen is which budget is the real one? Mr. Speaker, this sleight of hand, where the government habitually, ritualistically underplays the financial requirements and later seeks supplementary funds, raises serious questions about the credibility of the initial budgetary figures. It leaves citizens and policymakers grappling with a financial sense of disarray, unsure of whether the government's budgetary projections are genuine or mere placeholders, so to speak, for the eventual plea for more money. Does the minister not know that the reliance on supplementary funds not only signals a failure in adequate and accurately forecasting, but also unveils a disturbing lack of strategic planning? It reflects a government that may be either oblivious to the true financial needs of the nation or intentionally downplaying them for optics. In either case, it undermines the very essence of responsible government and prudent financial management. Mr. Speaker, the practice of consistently returning to the House to supplementary funds in a real way transforms the budget process into a preliminary endorsement leaving parliamentarians and citizens questioning the authenticity of these figures. Understanding democratic governance, Mr. Speaker, the continuous reliance on supplementary funding raises fundamental questions about the transparency and accountability of the budgetary process. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that the citizens of this country deserve a budget that truly reflects the needs of the nation, not a mere prelude to a never-ending quest to supplementary funds. This nonsense must stop. The level of spending, Mr. Speaker, this level of spending could only be as a result of a number of factors which we want to put some reason to. The misuse of funds, improper planning, and certainly, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the PPP, we should not rule out corruption and the fraudulent conversion. Corruption is undisputable.
Okay, we have two issues here. The misuse of funds, you cannot, the standing order says, impute. And second issue, I don't think the last word you use is parliamentary. So let's continue on a good course.
Corruption is undisputably contributed to political.
And again, you repeated it. We ruled on that budget that this is the 5th budget presentation we're going through.
Mr. Speaker, the source of Guyana's $1 trillion budget, the source, Mr. Speaker, of the government $1 trillion budget is the agreement signed by the APNU and Exxon. The government's approach to inclusivity is illustrated in the repealing of the Natural Resource Fund passed by the APNU-AFC. The government removed several safeguards against the abuse of the oil refunds on oil resources accruing to this nation. In the repeal legislation, there was provision for the establishment of a macroeconomic committee to advise on the maximum economically sustainable amount that could be withdrawn from the fund, taking into account past spending from the fund, the potential impact of future spending on Guyana's competitiveness, economic growth, agriculture and manufacturing, the assessment of macroeconomic variables, inflation, exchange rate, balance of payments, and other public debt. The substituted provision provides us for a schedule of annual withdrawals from the fund, thereby dispensing with the need for the exercise of professional judgment by a team of independent experts in advising on the amounts to be withdrawn. Mr. Speaker, the reputable chartered accounting firm Raman McKay, in a recent Starbucks News report, indicts this government's misuse of the people's money, projecting a loss this year of more than $100 billion from ineffectiveness. This firm did not mince words, reminding us that the touted largest budget in history is all for the wrong reasons, as evidenced by the absence of an independent planning authority to oversee the capital budget, which is now $666.1 billion. Mr. Speaker, according to Raman McKay, Guyana will lose in excess of 10% through inefficiencies, which represents more than $100 billion before any supplementary provisions is brought. There is no financial capacity or capability to handle sums of monies passing through the ministries. The 400 projects, many of which bear questionable names, will not be subjected to any serious evaluation and have the hallmarks of a slush fund. Mr. Speaker, this budget has expanded the opportunities for squandermania, or as the PPP's own Dr. Jagan would say, and I quote, waste, fraud, and abuse, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, assuming that this budget is a real one, Mr. Speaker, the very core of this trickle-down economy to which I refer to is a contentious issue that the government is funneling unprecedented sums to very few at the top by giving handouts to the grassroots. There's public knowledge that there's a massive concentration of wealth among the few privileged persons, leaving the majority to contend with the crumbs that fall from the rich banquet. Even the distribution of cash grants and other assistance to the poor has been marred by irregularities. What happened to the COVID cash grants? When will thousands of citizens be relieved of their pink slips? This is the 5th budget presented by the Honorable Minister. Yet the PPP has not been able to concentrate or demonstrate its ability or genuine commitment to improve the quality of lives of the citizens, let alone talk about prosperity for all. And who is really included in this all? Citizens' lived experiences and realities in local communities have created a sense of exclusion rather than one of ownership and inclusion. Perhaps this is the reason why there's absolutely no public excitement or active interest among the populace in the days leading up and the announcement of the reading of this year's budget. This critical event, the presentation of the nation's budget in the life of a government, has become a farce under this administration. Mr. Speaker, as the government of our oil-rich country parades the grandiosity of its trillion-dollar budget, a glaring void emerged, the stark absence of an overarching strategy. Instead of witnessing a visionary roadmap, citizens are left to grapple with a financial behemoth, devoid of clear direction, plunging our nation into a precarious abyss of financial uncertainty. Again, this lack of strategic direction exacerbates the risk of funds being allocated haphazardly without a cohesive plan that prioritizes the most pressing needs of our nation. Mr. Speaker, styling the budget, staying the course, giving the nation's exponential wealth in the hands of a few and growing poverty, we will be in order to question why at this time. Mr. Speaker, the government has no short-term, medium-term, or long-term plans for this nation. Yet we are being told that the policy prescriptions which will be put in place will reduce poverty, improve malnutrition, reduce the rate of high school dropout, stop the nation who was the envy of the region for intelligence from lagging behind countries in this region. Budgetary decisions should be grounded in a nuanced understanding of the social fabric, ensuring that resources are directed towards uplifting the most vulnerable rather than exacerbating existing disparities. Mr. Speaker, we continue to see disinvestment in our people. Contrary to Barajagio's statement, the honorable member, at a press conference, that there are pockets of poverty in the midst of wealth, poverty is pervasive in Guyana. According to Food for the Report, the poverty rate, that is the share of the population living below $5.50 per day, is about 38.8%, which is among the highest in the Caribbean and Latin America. Another startling statistic is the intensity of deprivations in Guyana, which among the UDP, NDP, is 30.3%. Very little, if anything at all, has been done for human development and human upliftment. Very little has been done in this area. For example, the allocation for the University of Guyana for 2024 is 4.1 billion, but the amount given to the Gold Project for this year is 4 billion. No report has ever been submitted to this National Assembly on the impact of this program. It is an insult and an abrogation of the duty to make the claim that the University of Guyana must have programs that are accredited in Guyana when the university is a state-owned institution. And it is the responsibility of the government of Guyana to ensure that programs are accredited. This university was founded by Dr. Jagan and expanded by Forbes Burnham. This government seems to have little or no interest in ensuring that the university functions as a 21st century tertiary institution equipped to meet the developmental needs of the people and society. We would like to know who credited the gold programs. The government has failed to invest in the people by instituting free education in accordance with Article 27 of the Constitution. The reality of the circumstances of the quality of life of large sections of the population are as such. 25% of the indigenous children are stunted, a figure higher than the national average. 60% of the newborn indigenous children are born underweight. Children from rural and urban poor families and other marginalized groups suffer from multi-poverty related deprivations. The lack of social protection measures contribute to the cycle of domestic abuse, violence, and neglect. Most vulnerable children belong to already disadvantaged groups, indigenous and tribal peoples, and urban poor. Many children are not acquiring the skills needed for decent employment and limited opportunities for adult participation and engagement. Schools' curricula do not offer 21st century skills. As of 2023, Mr. Speaker, one ought not to be shocked to find that there will be no observable impact on income inequality among the peoples and races in this country. There will be no dent in poverty. 42% of the indigenous people live in poverty. 50% of the Indo-Guyanese live in poverty. 20% of the African Guyanese live in poverty. Mr. Speaker, considering the rule of law, Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Minister presented a $1 trillion budget for 2024 and boasted our economy is moving full throttle. He talks about the dizzying pace at which we are delivering a modern Guyana. Yet the leadership of his government has failed miserably to do the basic things to enhance and strengthen the constitutional and legal framework. For example, after 4 years in office, the president is still to initiate consultation under Article 127(1) of the Constitution, which would lead to the appointments of a substantive chancellor of the judiciary and a substantive chief justice. In 2022, Justice Adrian Saunders, president of the Caribbean Court of Justice, called it a notable stain on Guyana's judicial landscape. He called for substantive appointment of a chancellor and chief justice to be made before the year 2022. Mr. Speaker, in the case of Vince Roy Jordan versus the Attorney General, Justice Young granted declarations compelling and requiring that the president must initiate the process of consultation as required by the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, despite the CCJ specifically saying in the case of Air Services Limited against the Attorney General that it is the president and the officials of state who are required to initiate consultation, notwithstanding the declaration by the High Court and the Caribbean Court of Justice exposition of the law that places the president on a constitutional duty to initiate this consultation, 10 months have elapsed since the decision without any discharge of the president's constitutional duty to initiate the process of consultation. The failure by the president...
Honorable member, the references to the president with respect to influencing the debate is a non-starter also. So you have to withdraw those.
Mr. Speaker, the failure by the executive, by the government, is now a travesty and a grave and continuing breach of the Constitution. We are in 2024 with a $1 trillion budget, but no substantive appointments. These appointments are not a matter of mere force. It's the cornerstone of a well-functioning democracy. The absence of two substantive judicial figures constitutes a serious institutional void, undermining the principles of independent and effective judiciary required for the purpose of upholding the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, the Law Reform Commission was established in 2021. It has been said by the government that you can only reform the law if you're aware of what the law currently is. But strangely, this has seemingly stifled and shaped the law reform process. The Law Reform Commission has not published and or indicated its readiness or interest in receiving from the public any suggestions for law reform. Also, the Law Reform Commission has not announced that it had submitted or identified any program or areas for law reform. Mr. Speaker, the chairman of the Law Reform Commission has indicated that in the 18 purple volumes of the laws of Guyana, and I quote, there were many mistakes, grammatical and typographical, which infected the whole process of law reform. Mr. Speaker, these creeping mistakes occurred as a result of the incompetence of the very current Attorney General in 2022 at the cost of millions of dollars. On the question of legal aid, Mr. Speaker, many of our citizens, especially the poor and vulnerable, do not have access to this vital service. There's little awareness about this aspect of our legal architecture. Mr. Speaker, the opposition envisaged a legal aid action plan, a roadmap to ensure the effective provision of legal aid services by the government and other stakeholders based on collaborative and cooperative efforts in legal aid services, which would raise the awareness and ensure the provision of legal right education at the community level. Further, with respect to the Constitution, respect for rule of law, the government has neglected to establish crucial commissions, including the Human Rights Commission, the Tribunal for the Ethnic Relations Commission, the Rights of the Child's Commission, and the Petroleum Commission. Mr. Speaker, the International Inter-American Convention Against Corruption obligates Guyana to create, maintain, and strengthen the system to protect public servants and private citizens in good faith reporting acts of corruption. Mr. Speaker, the Protective Disclosures Act of 2018, which is an important tool against mismanagement, corruption, and unethical behavior. To date, this act has not yet been operationalized by the issuance of the relevant order by the Minister of Legal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, with all the oil money, consultancies, and experts available to the government after 4 years, not much has happened in legal affairs. The justice system is burdened with extremely limited support from this government. Mr. Speaker, the government risks misallocating funds leading to inefficiencies and perpetuating unmet social needs. The budget lacks measurement and is akin to a scientific experiment without controls, with results being arbitrary.
Control from this side, honorable member says you'll need to get 5 minutes to conclude.
Comrade Speaker, I do move that the honorable member be given 5 minutes to conclude his presentation.
Thank you, Honorable Chief Whip for the opposition. Honorable member, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the budget lacks measurement, which is akin to a scientific experiment without controls, results being arbitrary and conclusions lack empirical grounding. The action by the government is a fundamental deviation from the principles of evidence-based government. It can only shape a narrative of fiscal opaqueness, inefficiency, wastage, and a missed opportunity for real social economic progress. In the world's fastest growing economy, the 1.146 trillion budget is devoid of a plan that would provide social and economic upliftment for the small man, workers, pensions, youth, and traditional business. This is a budget that panders to the friends, family, and favorites of the PPP. Mr. Speaker, this nation's founding fathers and mothers, Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow, Cheddi Jagan, Forbes Burnham, J.P. Lakshman Singh, Janet Jagan, Peter Degar, Jane Phillips Gray, would weep at the vast inequalities and inequities that exist in this society and the contempt for ordinary people and businesses. We urge a rethinking of this budget that undoubtedly opens the floodgates to exclusion, waste, fraud, and abuse. Mr. Speaker, this House is reminded of the advice given on the 16th of January, 1964, during the budget debate where the honorable member Forbes Burnham, as he then was, said, the opposition's coalition proposals will be made very clear during these debates. We say to you that the problems in Guyana are not the problems of the PPP or the problems of one section of the community, but the problems of the Guyanese people. And if we understand that and face this problem in this spirit, I'm sure that a more realistic attitude will be brought to the problems of this country. And that instead of sniping and snaring at those who fight to improve the economic and social position of Guyana, we should devote our efforts to abolishing the reason for our backwardness, poverty, and degradation. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very, very much, Honorable Member. And you did display a great example of how persons can switch into